Next up is Helen Zia. Helen has a story about finding her voice and using it. Take it away, Helen.
Hi, I'm so humbled to be here. And I'm going to tell the story about a girl who felt so invisible because everywhere she went with her family, herself, people stopped and stared as though they were hideous aliens from Mars. Even though that girl was born and raised in New Jersey, people were always telling her, go back where you came from. Or they seemed shocked that she could even speak English. And of course, that girl was me. That's what it was like to grow up as an Asian American child, the daughter of immigrants from China in the latter part of the 20th century. Because for a long time, immigrants from Asia weren't even allowed to become citizens of America. They were seen as rats, as people who ate rats, as people who carried disease, as people who could never be decent or loyal Americans. And they couldn't vote or even become part of this democracy. It wasn't until 1952, the year that I was born, that the last of those barriers were torn down. Unfortunately, the discrimination against people who look like me continued. And I grew up wondering whether I even belonged in America because people were so often telling me to go back or that I was a foreign invader. But I also grew up at a time when there were great movements for social change, and they were taking place then. The civil rights movement was in full bloom. Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, they all spoke to me, even though I was a little yellow girl. I heard the calls for women's equality, for an end to war, for gay liberation, and I wanted to be part of all of them. They were cries for freedom and democracy, to make America a better place for all people. Now, my parents struggled to raise 6 kids, and I knew I would have to get a scholarship if I hoped to go to college. And boy, did I want to go to college. I wanted to be part of those movements. And so as soon as I got to college, I searched for and found other students of color who also wanted to make a difference. And I found other Asian American kids who were like me. After college, I thought about becoming a doctor because that's what the kids of immigrants think about. But my heart was set on being a community organizer, and I threw myself into feminist activism to end sexism as well as racism. I actually became part of an effort to integrate the construction trades, which were then all white, all male, and very highly paid. And I actually became a construction laborer in 1976. I was one of the first women of color to break that barrier. And one day, a fellow activist said to me, if you really want to know about making social change in America, you should go to the heartland of America. I was young. I thought that was a great idea. And I packed up and I moved to Detroit, Michigan. I thought I would be part of the great trade union movement, the labor movement of America. And I soon got a job working at one of the big three auto companies as a large press operator, stamping out steel hoods, doors, all those steel parts that go into making a car. And I actually did that for a number of years, working alongside Black, Arab, white workers. We got to know each other well. We shared our joys and our woes. And I organized among my fellow workers to end apartheid in South Africa and to end racism in America. None of those issues especially focused on Asian Americans. And it didn't really seem to matter that here I was, an Asian American young woman, organizing in a place where there were not so many people who looked like me back then, until it just didn't seem to matter. Until one day it did matter because a terrible economic crisis took place. It hit America, centered on the Midwest and the auto industry. What happened was that nobody could afford to buy their gigantic American gas guzzling dinosaur cars, and the auto industry collapsed. along with the entire supply chain. I and millions of other workers in America were suddenly out of work, and it seemed like we would never find another job because that crisis went on for years. By 1982, it was year 3 of that economic recession, and the politicians, the corporate heads, the media, even the unions, my union, agreed on one thing, that they would blame Japan for all of America's woes. So it was like declaring war against Japan. In fact, they called it a war. And people of Japan were the enemies. People who drove Japanese made cars were shot at on the freeways. People who looked Japanese were like a moving target. And why was that? Because Japan was able to produce good fuel efficient cars. Now, so was Germany. But for people to use racism and xenophobia and to scapegoat other people, they have to look different. And so everyone was frustrated. Everyone was miserable and suffering and angry at anyone who looked Japanese. In that climate of hate, that anger boiled over when a young Chinese American man named Vincent Chin was beaten to death with a baseball bat by 2 white auto workers who saw him and said, "It's because of you, mother F's, that we're out of work." Vincent Chin was out for his all-American bachelor party that night with his buddies. His 400 wedding guests went to his funeral instead. And that would have been tragic enough. But then the judge sentenced the 2 murderers to probation and said, "These are not the kind of men you send to jail." Well, all of Detroit rose up in outrage because who are the kind of men you send to jail for murder in a city that's majority African American? Yet there were no Asian American voices to speak up against this climate of hate that led to the killing of a Chinese American whose only crime was looking Japanese. You see, back in the 1980s, Asian Americans weren't united. There wasn't even a word like Asian American. There were Americans who were Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Filipino, Indian, Pakistani, and so many other heritages from Asia. But there was no NAACP or National Organization for Women to speak for Asians. Now, by this time, I had discovered my voice as a journalist to write about the stories and the people that I saw. And since I suspected that anti-Asian racism might have had a little bit of a role to play in this murder, I contacted the Chinese American leaders who were mentioned in those news stories. And one of the first meetings I went to was at the restaurant where Vincent Chin had worked as a waiter. I didn't know anybody in that room, but they were all asking the same question. What can we do? What can we do about this injustice? When there wasn't any organization that ever had advocated for Asian Americans for them before. Vincent Chin's mother, Lily, was in the room, sobbing. Her heart was broken. It was as though her son had been killed again when the judge sentenced his murderers to freedom. The handful of Asian American lawyers in Michigan were also in the room, and one by one, they said, "There's really nothing that can be done if a judge doesn't agree to change his sentence," and they never do that. And I could feel the energy just sort of leaving the room as each one said, "There's nothing we can do. There's nothing we could do." And I wondered to myself at that moment, is this going to end here because there's nothing to be done? And I slowly felt my hand going up, raising my hand, even though I had the sinking feeling that I was about to destroy my brand new journalism career because reporters weren't supposed to even act like they had an opinion. But my hand went up and I said, "We might not be able to change the judge's sentence, but we have to let everyone know that this injustice is something Asian Americans cannot stand for. And then I put my hand down. Well, Vincent's mother, Lily Chin, stopped crying. Instead, she stood up and she said, "That's right. We must let all Americans know that this is wrong." Lily Chin was just so destroyed by grief, yet she bravely led what would become a national civil rights movement of Asian Americans, bringing together all these different groups who then joined hands with Black Americans, with Latinx people, with women, with LGBT people, with people of all faiths and all walks of life to stand together for something called justice in America. It was such an honor for me to work alongside of Lily Chin and so many people to fight for justice. And that civil rights movement was really a shining example of multiracial and multicultural unity to do something together with common ground of all people that brings about a positive change. This movement brought about a change for all Americans. For example, in Michigan, the right for a victim to speak in court at a sentencing was known as the Vincent Chin rule. And it became part of a movement that's led to victim impact statements that women and the Me Too movement have used so powerfully against sexual assault. This Asian American civil rights movement also helped to broaden the understanding of what hate crimes in America are, and that they protect now against all kinds of hate, including those that involve gender, sexual orientation, disability, and immigrants like Vincent Chin. The legacy of that civil rights movement is still carried on today and has great meaning today when there is also the beginning of an economic recession that we are all facing, and that's compounded by a pandemic and a public health crisis. We're also seeing a new wave of hate affecting so many different groups, continuation of violence against Black Americans, and an intense rising tide of anti-Asian racism directed against people who look Chinese, because some of our leaders are saying that they should be blamed for not only the virus, but everything that's happening to America today. Now, all I did back then was to raise my hand and to say that all people deserve the right to live with dignity, to have justice, and to live without violence. I raised my hand, and everybody can raise their hand, and we all must. Thank you so much. It's my honor to be here. Thank you.
Helen, thank you so much for your work and your lifetime dedicated to the safety, the equality, justice for so many people. It is deeply stirring to hear your story and to receive it this evening.
Thank you.